If you've done any modern UI development with a framework that uses JavaScript or TypeScript, you're probably familiar with reactive extensions and observables. You've probably heard of these things in .NET as well. In fact, reactive extensions started with .NET. But do you know what the benefits are, and do you know how to use them with MVVM without having to switch to a different paradigm like MVU or Redux? You can, and I'm going to show you how. Hi, I'm Matt Goldman, and I'm going to show you a very simple .NET MAUI app that I have running here. Now, I should be very clear that what I'm going to explain today is about MVVM. It's not about .NET MAUI. So if you're using WPF or Uno or Avalonia, all this is going to work just exactly the same. It doesn't really matter. This applies to MVVM. I'm using MAUI because, of course, I love it. So I have here a simple .NET MAUI app built using just the template that comes out the box. So you click the button a few times and the counter goes up. So nothing special there. Although what I have done is I have changed it to use MVVM. So you can see here that the main page, I'm injecting a main view model and setting that as the binding context, and in here I've got the code that basically came out of the code behind that was in the main page in the template. I've added these observable properties, so I'm using source generators from the MVVM community toolkit, which I've already installed because I don't want to write all that boilerplate myself. I've changed the event handler to a method here with a relay command decorator on there, so that's been generated for me. And in the UI, I've just changed the bindings here. So the text here is now binding to that button text, and the command is now binding here and using command instead of the event handler. Other than that, I haven't changed anything else. Well, actually, I've put this page inside a flyout item in Shell so that I can have a flyout. So you can see here, I've just got the one item here, which is home, which takes us to here, but I've got this score at the top as well. So at the moment when I click this is going up, but nothing's happening here. So I want this value to reflect changes here as well. So how do we solve that problem? There's actually a few ways. Now, one way is to use the messenger in the MVVM community toolkit. Well, I've already got the MVVM community toolkit installed, so why don't we use that? Well, I've already got most of that set up actually, so let's take a look. So if I go to Shell, you can see that I'm injecting a shell view model and I'm setting that as the binding context. And if I look at shell here, we can see that that label is already using a binding to that score message. So let's take a look at the view model. So the view model in the shell view model has that observable property here, and I'm using weak reference messenger to subscribe to a score changed message here, and I'm setting that value based on what I get from that. Okay. Cool. Alright, well, I've got that message here, very simple, very vanilla, just inherits this value change message from the MVVM community toolkit. So all I need to do now, right, is go back to my main view model and in here just send a message. Okay, so we're going to go weak reference messenger.default.send new score changed message and pass in the value of count. Great. Okay, so now if I run this with that one small change, I say one small change, I've already done all the other changes like creating the message and creating the subscription here, but now in my main view model I'm just sending that message. So now I click this button, count goes up here and the score goes up there. Great, that's working really well. What's the problem with that? Well, there's a couple of problems actually. One problem is that this kind of publisher subscriber approach is great and it's working well now for what we're doing for this, but it really should be used in cases where you've got completely separated and decoupled activities going on. So thing A sends publishes a message, thing B subscribes, thing A and B know nothing about each other and don't care, and they do their own thing in their own time. This is a very simple example here, but it becomes more problematic when you actually need to synchronize that data back. Like, what happens if that score changes somewhere else? What happens if there are other subscribers? What happens if there are other things sending that message? This can very, very quickly become a tangled mess. Not really an issue in this simple example, but this can very quickly become problematic. Okay, so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to, let's get rid of the namespaces I'm using. I'm going to delete this whole message, so I'm not going to use that. And that means now in my shell view model, I can't subscribe to that anymore either. So let's get rid of that. What I was doing before, if you forget about the flyout and you think about MVVM, in MVVM your view model is responsible for the state of your view, right? But now we're sharing score across the whole app. So this is no longer view specific state. This is app-wide state. Okay, so we need to manage that app-wide state centrally. So the typical way to manage something centrally is through a service. So I'm going to go ahead and add a score service. So services. Okay, and just clean this up a little bit. And before I forget, before anything else, I'm going to go ahead and register this in my dependency injection. Services. Great. Thank you very much, Copilot. It's incredible. It knows exactly what I want to do. That's awesome. So let's close this. Okay, so the first thing that I need here is a central value, a central actual state. So let's go ahead and add a field, private int score. Okay, and now I need to do a couple of other things. So I need to provide a method to increment it. So let's go ahead and add that. Increment score, score plus plus, great. And now I need a way of getting it as well. So public int get score, return score. And I just want to initialize this as well. Great, so I've got a constructor, initializing it to 0. I've got a method to set it and a method to get it. Now, in different circumstances, this might be different, right? So I may have, I may want to actually provide set score. So I might go public void set score int new score. And all I'm going to do here is go score equals new score. I'm not going to use this, but I'm just adding it just so you can see it as an example. In other cases, if you want to have central state management, then you have to provide a way of setting that state. In this case, we're never going to set the value directly. We're only going to increment it. But you may have cases where you want to set it directly. Okay, great. So we've got all that. So let's go back to our main view model. And now all I need to do is, I need to inject that service in here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to add a constructor. And in here, I'm going to inject my score service. Assign it to a field. Great. And now all I need to do is go into here and go score service increment score. Okay. I can go back to my shell view model. Let's inject it in here. Score service. Okay. And now all I have to do when I need to update the score is go, var score equals score service dot get score. Now I've got a little bit of a problem here, right? Which is it's all well and good setting that in the constructor, but I need a way of knowing when that score has changed so I can actually call this method and update it. Well, there's a few ways I can do that. I can do that with weak reference messenger, and now we've gone back round in a circle. Okay, so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use Reactive Extensions, and I'm going to make this app reactive. So you've probably heard of reactive apps. As I mentioned earlier, the Redux pattern, something called MVU, observables, Reactive Extensions. This is what we're going to implement here. Now, there's other ways you can do this, so let's take a look at what some of your options are. Well, one thing you could do is you could use this package called Comet. Okay, it's experimental, but this is awesome. This lets you use something called the MVU pattern. Now, MVU is a bit different to MVVM. In MVU, your state is immutable. Okay, so what that means is when something happens in your view, you fire a command which updates the model, and when the model updates, it generates a new state, and when there's a new state, the view updates. This is pretty cool and people love this. This is the way that things are done in a bunch of different frameworks outside of .NET MAUI or WPF or any of that sort of stuff. But of course you can do it here as well using this package. But it is a paradigm shift, and it is learning a different pattern and a different way of doing things. What I want to do is I want to stick with MVVM. I just want to get all the best bits of this without having to abandon all my MVVM goodness. Another option you have is ReactiveUI. So ReactiveUI is another framework, and this is built on top of Reactive Extensions. So it's all about observables, Reactive Extensions, all that good stuff, and it's MVVM. Well, it's technically MVVM. So you do still build view models, and you do still do bindings and all that sort of stuff, but you do have to build your view models declaratively. Now, a lot of people love that. That's actually a benefit for most people, but I don't want to do that. I want to stay in the comfort and safety of my MVVM home that I'm familiar with. They also say it's composable, but this isn't that composable to me. I find it kind of hard to read, hard to compose. I find it much easier to just stick with my view models and just add bits and pieces as and when I need to. So ReactiveUI does a lot more than what I'm going to show you today, so it's well worth checking out. But it is a learning curve, and you do have to change the way that you do things. I don't want to change the way I do things. I want to keep doing what I'm doing. So let's have a look. Okay. So the first thing that I need to do is install that Reactive Extensions package. So I'm going to go Manage NuGet Packages and browse for system.reactive. And I'm just going to install the latest version, which is version 6. Okay, so that's installed. So let's just close down the things I'm not using. So now I can go back to my score service, and I can just change the way that this works basically completely. So let's get rid of all of this, right? What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a behavior subject, and the behavior subject is going to be something that's going to let me use Reactive Extensions to essentially declare when I'm setting a next value. So an observable is a stream of values rather than a single value one time. It's a stream of values. So you might say, here's the current value, here's the next value, here's the next value, and I'm going to create a behavior subject that's going to let me do that. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and do that now. So private behavior subject of type int score equals new. I'm not going to initialize this here. There we go. So now I need a way of exposing this externally, and I'm going to create a method called subscribe to score. Public I, and that's going to return an iObservable int. Now I'm just going to do this slightly different. I'm going to make this a method, and there's a reason why, and you'll see later. Okay, so that is just going to return the score as an observable. Okay, and I'm going to name this something meaningful, right? Score observable. Okay. Now I just want to initialize this, so I'm going to create a constructor, and in my constructor I'm just going to set this as a new behavior subject of type int with an initial value of 0. Okay, and now I need to add a method to increment that score. Okay, so I'm just going to go public void increment score, which we had before, and now I'm calling this onNext method on that score behavior subject, which is saying that the next value is now this value that I'm passing in here, which is actually just going to be the current value plus 1. Let's go ahead and inject that score service into our main view model, which we already have, and we're already calling that increment score. Great, we've already done all that. We don't need to make any changes here because the interface hasn't changed at all. So let's go back to shell view model. Okay, so now we've got this score service that we're assigning to a field here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to subscribe to it. Okay, so I'm going to create a private void subscribe to score, and in here I'm going to score service.scoreobservable.subscribe, and let me just close that off. So all I'm doing here is I've got the score observable, I'm subscribing to it. This is the next value. So what that means is that any time that there's a next value, I'm essentially just setting score message to score equals and that next value. Okay, that's it. Pretty straightforward. All right. So I'm just going to run that, and what we should hopefully see here is basically exactly the same thing as we saw before. Right. So I should be able to click that button, increment the score, and when I do, that change will be reflected immediately in the flyout. So we've got the app running again. I can click the click me button, it increments, now says 9, open the flyout. That's not working. Let's take a look and see if we can figure out why. Okay, so very, very simple, very obvious reason. I haven't subscribed to it. So I've created a method called subscribe to score. So let's go ahead and now subscribe to score in the constructor. Pretty sure I can't hot reload this. Let's just, no. Yeah. So I'm gonna have to start the app again. That's fine, as expected. So now it starts up again. I can click me, great, 6, 7, and there it is. So now working exactly as expected. Okay, so that's pretty cool. But you might say, well, we haven't really improved anything. It's still working exactly as it was. So why is this better? Well, look, it isn't better, okay? So you've got to pick the right tool for the job. So in some cases, you might decide that you want to use the messenger that's in the MVVM community toolkit. That's great. The reason you would want to choose this approach is that, as I mentioned, this score service is now a central source of truth. So we now have centralized state for a value that's used all over the app. What happens if you start sending messages in different directions? You know, what happens if I need to increment this from elsewhere? What happens if, you know, this is a username? Let's say, common scenario, let's say you've got a page in your app that lets someone change a profile picture, and that profile picture is in the flyout as well. You know, these can be changed different directions, different places, plus in that case you have to wait for confirmation from the API that that's been updated, potentially. So there's lots of reasons why you might choose to use this approach instead. And this idea of having this central core source of truth, central state, that's reactive, that updates everywhere at the same time that's subscribing to it, I think that's pretty awesome. But you can take this a step further, okay? So just taking another look at Comet, there's something here that I really, really like, okay? And that is this concept of this state type. So I really like this. I really like the simplicity of this. Now, the way that this is implemented in Comet is completely 100% different to what I'm about to show you. Okay, so the way that this is implemented in Comet is directly related to this MVU approach. But I like this idea. So I'm going to borrow this idea and implement it differently in a way that's going to work with what I'm doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is create that class. So I'm going to put it in a folder called helpers, and I call it state. Now, to save time, I'm not going to type this all out. I'm just going to paste this in, and then I'll explain what it's doing. Just bring in the right namespaces. Okay, so as we saw in Comet, it's generic. Okay, so I've got a type of a class called state T. Its type's generic. I've got a behavior subject, and I've got a constructor. The constructor enforces an initial state, which I quite like. I have this current value, which exposes the current value if you need it. I've got the behavior subject as an observable, which I'm probably not going to use, and I might take this out. I don't like it, and you know what? I don't really like that either. Okay. The important parts are subscribe and set value. Now, subscribe is returning an iDisposable, and that's important, and I'll show you why later. But essentially, it's almost a lazy abstraction because it's just giving us this action on change, which could be called on next or whatever, which is the same as what we get from the observable here. I'll just put these back for now, even though I'm not using them. It's the same as what we get here, right? But there's a reason I'm doing this differently. And then I've got this set value method, which essentially just passes in the new state and calls on next on that subject and just sets the new state. Okay, so I really like this, and there's a reason I like this, and I'm going to show you how I would refactor that score service, and then I'll explain why. So let's get rid of all of this again and start again using my state type. So I'm going to put private state, and nope, I don't want a state trigger, I want a state type int, and I'm going to call this score. Okay, now I need a constructor, and I'm going to set its initial value to 0. Great. Okay, now I need to bring that method back where I increment it, so let's bring that back. Okay, so what this is doing is essentially the same thing that it was doing before, except I'm calling set value using the current value. So in fact I am getting that current value, and I'm adding 1 to it, and I'm setting that as the current value. The last thing that I want to do is, because this is private, so I can't anywhere outside of here subscribe to that disposable here, so I'm just going to abstract that away here as well. Okay, so I'm going to go public iDisposable subscribe to score, and that's, let's just let Copilot do that for me, because that's actually exactly what I want. Okay, so all I'm doing here is I've got an action of type int called onChange, and I'm subscribing to the state. I'm just exposing that subscription on that score. Again, you might consider that a lazy abstraction, but there's a reason why I've done it, and that's important. And I'll show you why. Okay, so let's go back to our main view model. Well, I don't have to change anything here because this is encapsulated pretty well. I've still got that increment score method. No changes there, nothing required. That's great. I'll go back to my shell view model, and I do need to make the change here, okay? So all I need to do is change this to subscribe to score, and that's now going to work exactly as it did before, okay? So I can run this, and we shouldn't see any change. This should work exactly as it did before. But this is a big improvement, and let me explain why. Make sure that it's working. Yep, perfect. Let me explain why this is a big improvement. The reason is that now score service still exists, and that is now the central source of truth for state for the score value, okay? I have this state property here. What I've done differently now is that the flow of data is one way, okay? So in MVVM, the view model is responsible for the state of the view, and that is still the case here, okay? So the view model is still responsible to the state of these values, which these represent values in the view, not values in the state of the app. Same thing in the shell view model here. This string here, this property that's generated by this source generator, represents the state of a value in the view, the state of the view, not the state of the app. So if I want to subscribe to changes to the state of the app, I just subscribe here, and then I set whatever is relevant in my view, which is the scope of the view model, I set it here. In my main view model, I'm kind of doing the same thing here. I could refactor this and improve this with this count here if I wanted to, and I would if this was a real app, but I'm not going to now. But again, you know, within my view model, I can manipulate the state of the view, but I can't directly manipulate the state of the score, because that's an app-wide state. All I do is call a method on the score service to manipulate that. So I've kind of borrowed the best bits of this MVU pattern here, where I've got this one-way flow of data, a central source of truth and state, but I'm still safely within the comfort of my comfy MVVM armchair where I like it. So I really like this approach. One last thing I have to show you though is, as I mentioned, I do have this as an iDisposable. Now it is important with Reactive Extensions to dispose and unsubscribe. So what I would do here, for example, is in my score service, I would have to make this. In fact, I'm not going to do it here, but what I would do is potentially here in my shell view model, I would inherit iDisposable here and implement that. And all I'm going to do now is create a field to represent that subscription. In my subscribe here, let me just bring that onto a new line just to make it easier to read. I would just set that to the field, and then in my dispose, I just call score subscription.dispose. Now, how do you call this dispose on this view model? Well, you would call it from the page, and in this case it would be the shell, and it kind of gets the turtles all the way down. And then how do you call that? Well, that's an entirely different question, and .NET MAUI doesn't handle that out of the box. There's an ongoing discussion about how to do it on the MAUI repo. I'll add a link to that in the description. Take a look, have a read. How you do it is up to you. If you don't do it, don't do it, but you're going to get memory leaks and your app is going to crash. So if you are using observables, make sure you unsubscribe. So I want to know what you think. How do you feel about this mashup of concepts like observables and reactivity with MVVM? Are you going to use this in your apps? Let me know. I'm Matt Goldman. Thanks.